Continue then as we do talk about Professor Stan Sangweni and his sad passing today. We're now joined by former ANC NEC member and ANC veteran Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi. Ma'am, a pleasure to see you. Thank you very much for being with us here on SABC News.
Good afternoon.
Let's start by talking maybe on the personal side in terms of your first, the first interactions you remember with Professor Sangweni, how you were perhaps introduced to him and what you'll remember mostly about the Prof.
You know, I'm not only going to talk about Prof in the liberation movement and knowing him from exile.
No.
I think I would do injustice. I should talk about the most recent period when I worked very closely with Prof. Sangweni, and that was when he was the chair of the Public Service Commission.
Yeah.
I was Minister for Public Service and Administration, and during the period of 1999 to 2008, we worked very closely together. And here we had this gentle giant who was very passionate about his engagement on a number of areas. You've heard his CV and the roles he's played professionally in the UN Economic Community for Africa. You've heard about him in his role in the area of environment. So I want to bring it to our Constitution and Chapter 10 of our Constitution, where he, as the chair of the Public Service Commission, was passionate about the values by which the public service could and should be run. The importance of impartiality, the importance of having a public service commission that would be one that's independent, that's impartial, that must exercise its powers and perform its functions without fear and favor or prejudice in the interest of maintenance of effective and efficient public service administration. The reason I feel it's important to raise these issues because this brings the person and the values he stood for to how he practically implemented this. And this was also particularly clear in the instance when he spoke in 2003 or 4, I believe, where he spoke about accountability. Yeah. And he spoke about the centrality of accountability to democracy, public accountability to democracy, where he said that there was a need for politicians, the governors, to be accountable to the governed, to those who they govern. And in turn, those who are governed having trust in the governors or the politicians who, together with the public service, would take forward what's required to ensure a better life for all people. So you talk about the gentle giant, you talk about the visionary, you talk about the patient, quintessential comrade and gentleman who would argue around the implementation of these issues and saw the realization of his role as a member of the liberation movement as very much interlinked to the practitioner role. Thanks.
Yeah. You know, it's so interesting you talk about the PSC, and in fact, it's almost as though you anticipated my next question, because what I wanted to say was, you know, you look at the term that, you know, he was chairperson of the PSC from 1994 to 2009. And I think that's quite interesting, given the fact that nowadays, you know, people in government institutions or those who head up institutions don't really stay very long in those positions. They change often and haphazardly at that. And I just want to talk to that, you know, his leadership role, the way he was as leadership, not just as the man. I mean, you talk about this gentle giant, which some of us have certainly heard in the past before, but really about the leadership. I mean, the fact that he was the chairperson of PSC for that duration of time does actually speak volumes, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. But you must remember the Public Service Commission and the commissioners are appointed by Parliament. And they serve their tenure as defined and clearly stipulated by the framework that's informed by the Constitution. And as I said, Chapter 10 of the Constitution. Yeah. Now, the interesting thing is that the remit of the work he covered dealt precisely with the issue of tenure, and we debated this quite a bit, I should say, and we were quite ready to debate the issues and agree and sometimes disagree on it, because at that particular point in time, we held a view that we would, for a period, place directors generals on contract. And it was simply for the reason that we felt that the first cohort, the first intake of directors general were people who were essentially involved in policy making, policy development, help shape that, and the regulatory framework. As we passed the first 5 to 7 years, we said we need to revisit that, because very clearly we need a group of directors general that will be practitioners involved in the implementation, the ones who could bring the policy and the implementation together. And in doing that, we also needed to look at how we govern the performance of the senior management. And it was the Public Service Commission that had the responsibility to look at the performance assessment. So again, in 2003, 2004, they did a study. And through the study, they looked at what were the challenges around the tenure of directors general in the public service. And the one provision he made was that there was a challenge around the relationship between public servants and ministers, one, because some of the ministers may be guilty, I may be guilty of that as well, were playing more of an activist role, and probably there wasn't a very clear delineation between the roles and functions of directors generals as to compared to the executive authority. And this is where we revisit the Public Service Act and the Public Service Regulatory Framework, something that's being looked at the moment as well. And we looked at this in relation to the Public Finance Management Act that very clearly spelled out these functions. So, he was reflecting on, how the Public Service Commission handles performance measurement as a tool to enhance accountability. So it was all about accountability. It was about our accountability, which is in line with the values that Prof. Sangweni stood for. He also looked at maximizing the impact of statutory bodies. So you must understand, he was not a public servant in the traditional sense. He was the chairman of a Chapter 10 body, of a statutory body that had a very important role. And they really played a foundational role in ensuring that it was impactful as it should be.
Yeah, and then just in closing, as we close this conversation, I'd really like to talk about perhaps if you can give a message really to his family at this time. One of the things that I said to the ANC spokesperson just before we spoke to you was, at the end of the day, this is someone who had to be shared with his family, whether it was the ANC, whether it was government, whether it was the PSC, but certainly he couldn't just be a family man. He also had to kind of be with the ANC and be with the liberation struggle. I mean, the fact that he had to be in exile speaks a lot to what the sacrifices that not only he had to make, but his family also had to make. And I think it would be an ideal place to end our conversation, where perhaps you give a message, please, to his family, as someone who worked quite closely with the Prof in his later years.
You know, we can't offer sufficient gratitude, whether it's as a political party, as government, or even the people of South Africa, in terms of the role that Prof. Sangweni, Uncle Stan, played in contributing in different ways to our liberation. Yeah. He made it very clear that your involvement must be multifaceted, and education was central to it. When I spoke to Aunt Angela this morning on hearing the news, I mean, she said, he's gone. And I said, he's gone. We almost wish that he could live forever. Mm. And she pointed out, and this was in a very personal context, so I'll only raise one part of it. She pointed out the fact that he was always a visionary. And she said in their 50 plus years together, that always came through. And you found that in every area of work. So I think, as I speak to the family, and I'm quite humbled by this, I do want to say that we know that he gave his all to ensure that he made a real contribution as part of many to the kind of constitution we have and the kind of future we must have. One that clearly speaks to a South Africa that belongs to everyone who lives in it. And that no one can justly claim authority. No government can, unless it is based on the will of the people. And he lived that. And we thank you as a family for sharing him with us and for being part of that contribution, because he was not doing it in isolation of you. And he never forgot Newcastle and Natal. That was always hope.
All right, it was such a pleasure speaking to you, and thank you, though the sad circumstances, for sharing so much with us this afternoon. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, that is Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi, the former Minister of Public Service. Then, of course, ANC veteran, chatting to us on the back of the passing today of Professor Stan Sangweni.